Hi everyone. Claire and I are both PhD students from Australia. I am from the University of New South Wales and Claire is from the University of Wollongong. We have both recently completed individual studies exploring methamphetamine use in a family context. We are presenting these in a joint presentation today, given the overlapping topic areas. Throughout this presentation, the purple colour will indicate my study, while the green represents Claire's.
So before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting on today, and would like to pay our respects to Aboriginal elders, past and present, who are the knowledge holders and teachers. We acknowledge their continued spiritual and cultural connection to country. So this image here is actually the Aboriginal language map, and this was developed by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. So Australia's first people have lived on the continent for thousands of years, and this map represents the many distinct cultural groups, each with their own languages, laws, and customs. And I think this map is really incredible because it really highlights that there are over 250 languages, and within that, over 600 dialects. So we are both joining you today from the southeast region of Australia, where that little circle is. So I'm joining you from the traditional country of the Awabakal and Worimi people.
And I am joining you from the traditional country of the Gadigal people. Claire and I will be presenting on two independent studies with similar samples and methodologies. We would like to acknowledge a few groups of people who made these studies possible. Firstly, and most importantly, we would like to thank all of the participants for sharing and trusting us with their stories. We would also like to acknowledge the funding bodies, partners, and research teams involved in these studies. My study also involved an advisory committee, including service providers and people with lived and living experience.
So just to speak to the background briefly, I think given the audience that we're all in today, we are all very aware that families experience significant burden from having a family member that uses drugs. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that while methamphetamine use is a global concern, we actually have particularly high rates of use here in Australia. And what we do know about methamphetamine use is that there are certain interpersonal behaviours that come along with this drug use that can be particularly challenging for family members. And these behaviours like agitation, paranoia, and these things can really impact the family dynamic. So past research in this area has really often looked at the parent-child relationship. And so this is whether potentially looking at the impact of parental drug use on the children, or the experience of being a parent of a young adult that uses drugs. So on this, there is really less that is currently known about the experiences of other relationship groups. So this is talking about significant others and partners, or siblings. These other kind of groups are less looked at. So there's also historically been a focus on the impact on families. So this is the burden and strain that we often speak about, but there's less understanding around family response and adaptations in the face of this stress and strain. And these are some areas that we're hoping to touch on in our work today.
So my study in particular was designed to explore the influence of methamphetamine use on the relationship between people using methamphetamine and other family members, and any subsequent influence on family members' lives.
And the study I'll be speaking about today aimed to identify adaptations in response to the stress and strain of supporting a loved one with methamphetamine use, and to really explore those resilience facilitating processes.
So just some methodological details first. So both of these studies involved qualitative interviews with Australian adults who self-identified as family members of someone who uses methamphetamine. Both studies also used thematic analysis with iterative categorization. My study, Study A, was conducted through Zoom and over the phone in the middle of last year. I recruited 19 participants from a variety of family roles, with most of the participants being parents, female, and most being recruited through Family Drug Support, which is a national service in Australia that provides support groups and phone support to families affected by AOD.
So for study B, the study that I worked on, we conducted phone interviews, which would average of 24 minutes each, so a bit shorter than Paige's calls. And these interviews were conducted in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, so in 2021. So we analysed data from 24 participants, and 21 of those were female. And this study was actually, so this was the baseline interview data that was collected as part of a larger study that was looking at the feasibility of a support program for families. So it's going to be important to keep in mind when we're looking at the results here that all the family members that participated had actually reached out for help in some way. And this is also the case for the majority of participants in Study A who were recruited through family drug support.
So I will be presenting the findings of my study first. Just to note that I'll be sharing some quotes on the screen, which you can read in your own time. And I'll also just note that any names included in my presentation are pseudonyms. When discussing how they first became aware of the methamphetamine use, most family members described physical and behavioural changes in their person, such as mood swings or sudden weight loss. Family members were often only able to attribute these changes to methamphetamine use after confronting their person. At this stage, family members felt that they were no longer dealing with the real person. They felt as though their person had become someone else who they couldn't relate to or connect with anymore. This was reflected in the frustration participants often felt when interacting with their person, as they often felt unsure of how their person would behave at any given time. Zara's emotional quote here highlights the despair she is experiencing in her perception of losing her daughter to methamphetamine use. A lot of family members were reluctant to accept that their person was using methamphetamine. This reaction from families is likely the first indication of stigma influencing family dynamics. Family members experienced grief in a number of areas. They mourned the person their loved one used to be and the connection they previously shared, perceiving this connection to now be lost. Families felt helpless in watching their person going through difficult times and feeling unable to help. Witnessing acts of self-harm in particular were devastating for families, and many participants expressed concern over their person passing away. Families also mourned the potential future they had previously wished for their person, a future that family members felt was no longer possible. The perceived loss of this future was not only accounted for by the psychoactive effects of methamphetamine, but also on the social limitations that methamphetamine-related stigma would place on them throughout their lives. Families usually went through an initial period of hyper-focus on the drug use and believed that they could fix the drug use by finding the right treatment. This period was associated with a range of emotions, including shock, disappointment, dread, and despair. Interactions with the person centered on imploring them to seek support and treatment for their substance use. Family members also frequently checked in with their person on how they were doing, which was often interpreted as nagging. Conversely, family members lamented the constant demands for money and the verbal abuse they often received if they refused. Overall, these types of interactions led to increased strain and tension in these relationships, and families grieved the absence of loving and supportive conversations with their person. Family members felt that the influence of methamphetamine use on family dynamics was all-consuming. Family life was described as chaotic, with an atmosphere of uncertainty and concern. Unexpected absences of the person using methamphetamine were common, as were confrontations between them and other family members. This led some family members to feel uncomfortable and sometimes unsafe in the home. Some participants saw their workplace as a welcome distraction away from the chaos they experienced at home. Most participants experienced a reduction in their ability and motivation to work, however. Some were unable to focus, had poorer decision-making skills, or had no desire to go to work. This meant that many participants had to take time off work, while others had to miss work during having to take care of their person. As well as relief from work for some family members, other participants received a reprieve when their person entered residential rehabilitation. The initial episode of rehab was met with relief, joy, and pride. Families were optimistic about what this meant for the future of their person and the rest of the family. When their person eventually began using methamphetamine again, however, these families of elation quickly morphed into disappointment and distress. This cycle often repeated many times, and families eventually lost hope for this future. Levi here described his experience of his brother entering and exiting rehabilitation as an emotional roller coaster. After experiencing these influence over family life for a period of time, participants began to establish boundaries around their interactions with the person using methamphetamine. These boundaries were an attempt to minimize the negative consequences I have just described, while still maintaining a relationship with their person. Limiting the provision of financial support and restricting their access to the family home were common. Despite knowing these boundaries were necessary and beneficial for all parties, it was not an easy process and had a significant emotional toll on family members. Relationships between the person using methamphetamine and their siblings were particularly complicated. Siblings expressed concern, compassion, and frustration in these relationships. They tended to resent their sibling for monopolizing their parents' attention, and sometimes felt that their sibling should know better than to use methamphetamine. Siblings' emotions were also conflicted by the distress they witnessed from their parents, the distress they witnessed their parents experiencing, with sub-siblings acting as a physical barrier during altercations within the family. This placed parents in the difficult position of feeling forced to intervene and mediate the relationship between siblings while trying not to take sides. Parents expressed a desire for their children to have a closer relationship, but also acknowledged the emotional turmoil that siblings experience. Expectations and experiences of being judged, criticized, and blamed for their person's substance use were prevalent across all interviews. Many family members had lost friendships after disclosing their person's methamphetamine use, leading to a reluctance to seek out to others in the future. When they did discuss their person with friends and family, they often received unwarranted, unhelpful, and often harmful advice, generally along the lines that their person should just stop using or that the participant should just cut them off. These experiences of stigma were especially felt by mothers, who were frequently blamed for their child's drug use and sometimes even blamed themselves. Overall, many participants described feeling socially isolated in association with experiences of stigma. Family members who were able to receive support from others, such as Florence here, spoke about how beneficial these positive interactions were. This social support, as well as the professional support that most families received, helped them to develop a greater resilience, a process which Clare will now explore in the context of her study.
Thanks, Paige. So as Paige mentioned, the results that I'm going to be talking about today are looking at the resilience facilitating processes, and this is families who were seeking help. And so this group that I'm talking about, we can kind of picture that they're a bit further along in their journey of supporting their loved one with methamphetamine use. So before I go into the results of my study, the final analysis was actually informed by this framework here, which is called the Family Resilience Framework. And this provides a conceptual overview of the key variables that are seen to facilitate growth and healing within families that are facing adversity of some kind. And as you can see, this framework identifies 9 distinct processes involved in the development of resilience, and these have been grouped into 3 subcategories. So this framework's actually been used to better understand processes that help families respond to challenges like mental illness, disability, chronic disease, and bereavement. But it hasn't actually been used yet to look at families affected by methamphetamine specifically. So this study will specifically look at the belief systems component, which is this top part. And this is made up of 3 main areas. So the first is meaning making. The second is positive outlook and hope. And the third is transcendence and spirituality. So the first theme I want to speak about today was acceptance and resignation. So almost all participants in the study spoke about navigating acceptance in the process of making sense of their experience supporting the loved one who was using methamphetamine. And in particular, families acknowledged this cyclic pattern of addictive behaviours. And I think Paige really summarised this nicely in her results section too. And as part of this, the recognition of their own limitations in influencing the outcome of their loved one's drug use. And interestingly, I think at times this also presented as a resignation and a sense of hopelessness in some of these participants as well. However, some family members who spoke about the effect of the stress and strain on their well-being and had that acceptance of the impact that this was actually having in their own lives seemed to demonstrate a renewed sense of empowerment of the need to really prioritise their own well-being. And I think this is really clearly captured in this quote that I'll just read out to you now. I just need to be able to cut myself off from this situation and then try and get my, I guess, sense of well-being back. And I think I'm on the edge of it. I can't use my son as an excuse to not be good to myself because it's the worst thing I can do, really. So the second perspective I want to mention today is called Alternative Perspectives to Develop a Compassionate View of Addiction. So this idea of taking different perspectives of addiction seemed to really shape a lot of participants' perspectives of their loved ones' drug use themselves, and also kind of zooming out and looking at their role in managing or supporting their loved one. So a lot of people spoke about hearing these different views or different perspectives of addiction through a bunch of different sources. And this looked like support groups, through just casual conversations with friends or family, and through professionals. And that these kind of integration of these alternative perspectives really helped them to support a more compassionate understanding of addiction and drug use. And I think this is really clearly highlighted by this comment by a mother who described the process of learning about a trauma-informed perspective and the positive impact this had on her well-being. And I'll just read that one out to you now too. So their take on it is that it's all trauma-based. It's not a choice. It's not a disease. People use drugs so they can feel better because they're struggling. I believe that theory. I've done some other reading and lots of self-help stuff. So I think I've come to a more compassionate place with it, which makes it probably a bit easier to deal with. So the third theme is called Transcendence and Finding Purpose. And this theme is really about this idea of families kind of zooming out and reconnecting with this higher value set. And participants often spoke about this in the idea of taking a step back from their role with their person, and reconnecting with their identity, which a lot of people spoke about having lost while supporting their loved one. And I think this quote again sums that up quite nicely. So what helps me is what I'm doing with you. I feel like I'm making a small contribution. I'm hopefully making things better down the track. So the last theme I want to mention today is hope and a positive outlook. So holding on to hope and a positive outlook and kind of looking into the future with this idea of there being the potential for change was spoken about, and it was spoken about in the way of really balancing this huge weight of the uncertainty and the grief of supporting their loved one, which I think Paige touched on a lot there too. So I'll read this quote by a parent of someone that was using methamphetamine use. But anyway, he tells me he went to AA last night. So I've just got to hope and pray that he's telling the truth. When he rang me and said about it, I tried to be positive and said, oh yes, did you really go? Well, that's wonderful. I don't say prove it or anything like that. You've got to trust, I suppose.
Sorry, mute. So just to sum up the findings of both of these studies, for my study in particular, but also for Claire's, experiences of stigma and discrimination really underscored a lot of these findings. Families struggle to feel included within their social networks as well as society as a whole, and want the same for their person who's using methamphetamine as well. Stigma prevents these families from seeking social and professional support, which is a really big issue considering social support in particular is constantly identified as vitally important for these families. We also need to consider families' own needs for support for themselves and not just their role in supporting their person to reduce their drug use.
Yeah, and I think Paige summed that up really nicely about the role of stigma and the real need here to focus on supporting families as an independent population in their own right as well, regardless of where their person is at on their own recovery journey. And I think what the results of this study found were that these adaptations in belief systems of families may be really helpful to start to target to facilitate resilience. And this could really impact the way that we design treatments and consider methods that can support those processes. So that might be providing different conceptualizations of addiction to support acceptance and really help families in their individual and unique situations that they are in to help integrate these ideas into the way they understand themselves and their role in supporting their person.
So thank you for listening to this joint presentation. Feel free to reach out to either Claire or myself after the conference today if you have any questions or just want to chat more about these studies.